Now we're on Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis, and the Gemara now is going to quote a machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. And as we saw on Amid Aleph, the issue here that first Chizkiah is going to address is Yayin Shenofel Abar. So we have Yayin of Isur coming into Yayin Heter, and we also have a Kiton Shel Mayim. It's Omer Chizkiah Higdilo BeIsur. When the yayin of Isur falls into the yayin of Heter, it expands the volume of yayin shel Isur because min b'mino afil b'mashulo botel. So the yayin of Heter now gets converted into yayin of Isur, and therefore it's asur. Why? Because there's not enough mayim coming in through this ketone to be mavatel the combination of the two yenos. Higdilo beheter mutter. If, on the other hand, now this is counter to everything we've been saying until now, if the mayim comes later, it gets last licks, if you want to use that term, mutter. Because then we're going to set up this mayim as a koach hamavatel against the yayin. And it's mid b'sheino mino, and therefore it's going to be mavatel. Now, it seems that the underlying logic of Chizkiah here is a kind of zev v'zeh gorim. When you have two causes and they join together two forces in order to create a certain effect, then we look at the last one that came in, because that was the clincher, so to speak. And we're going to have this in a minute in a case of two CRs. There's a CR of Chulin, which is Heter, and then you have a CR of Truma. And they both went into a dough. And CR is a fermenting agent. And each one of these two amounts of CR, whether Shel Chulin or Shel Truma, are not sufficient to generate the process of fermentation, of leaven, what we call leaven, of bread. The dough has to leaven. And according to the logic of Chizkiah, we're going to look at the last CR that fell in. If the last CR was Chulin, that clinched the fermentation, and therefore it's Chulin, it's mutter. But if the last CR that came in was Truma, then we look at it as Truma. So that's called a Zev Zeh Gorem situation, and we go by the last Gorem. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Afilu Dilo Be'isur mutter. Right, even if you increase the amount of yayin shel isur, because the yayin shel isur fell into yayin shel heter, it's mid b'mino in a bottle, nevertheless, the mixture is permitted. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, even though the nesach yayin was not mixed with water, the water came in later. Since the water fell in, just 1 second. Let me just read this carefully. Okay. Now, there's a complicated Rashi here. I'll mention it, but Dok V'Tishkach. It's way, way beyond the purview of this shir. And Rashi says that the case of Rabbi Yochanan now is that the water fell in first. And the Chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rashi, is that even though the yayin now should meet up with the other yayin within the mixture, and it would be min b'mino in a botel, nevertheless we don't say that, and we allow the mayim to attack and be mavatel the yayin nesach. But again, the simple pshat is without Rashi that the mayim did not fall in first, but the yayin shel nesach fell into the yayin shel isur, and then the mayim fell afterwards. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zara. This is going to be a very iffy kind of situation. The Gemara actually is going to reject Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says, maybe this is an old machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan and the Rabbanon, regarding the case of Sior. Disnan, we learned in the Mishnah in Trumos, actually it's in Orla, Sior shel chulim shel trum shenaflu l'toch ha'isa lo bazeh k'dei l'chametz lo bazeh k'dei l'chametz. So neither the leaven of chulin nor the leaven of truma had the ability in and of itself to cause the dough to leaven, to ferment. It's tarfu too only when they join forces together, as I called it before, zev zeh gorem, two causes. Then chimtzo, then they generate a leavening of the dough. Rabbi Eliezer Omer achron aniba. I look at the last thing that fell in, and if the last thing that fell in is truma, then it's also. What does it mean? It's also. It's also to a non-Kohen, a Zar. And even to a Kohen, if the Kohen is tameh, he's not allowed to eat this dough after it rises. The bread is also. And this, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, is identical and should be identified with Chizkiah, because Chizkiah says that it all depends what came last. And Chizkiah says that since the Mayim came last, we look at the Mayim of Heter as the primary cause, so to speak, and it generates the effect of Heter. Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, the Mishnah there in Orla, Bein shenafel isa b'tchila, bein shenafel b'sof, eino osra shiebo kedei lahachmitz. The forbidden leaven, which is the siyar of chametz, would only generate an iser if it has within itself the ability to generate the leavening process. And if it's together with another gorem, in this case the siyar of chulin, then the siyar of chametz does not have of truma does not have the power to generate an iser. So the Gemara says, "V'tizbra, I'm going to prove to you that this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim could not be identical with Chizkiah. And in fact, we're going to prove now, based on Abayi's qualification, that the Mishnah in Orla with regard to the Siyar is against Chizkiah, both according to Rabbanon and according to Rabbi Eliezer. The entire heter of Rabbi Eliezer, that we go basa the last Siyar that fell in, which means that if the last Siyar was Chulin, then we could be matir. That only applies, says Abaye, if the Kodav Silko, if the person removes the Siyar before it gets completely absorbed in the dough. So that means that what was left inside was only the Siyar of Chulin. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer is willing to be making. In any event, this all revolves around this question about Zev Gorim and so forth and so on. If the CR of Truma is still inside the Tarovas, then also Chizkiah the Omer Kaman. Now Chizkiah can't work out even according to Rabbi Eliezer. And why is that? Because Chizkiah said that Achar Achron, if the water came in last, then we could be matir, even in a case where low cut of a silko. Chizkiah never qualified it. So even if he did not remove the yayin nesech, and it would be almost virtually impossible to remove the yayin nesech, it's yayin v'yayin, two liquids mixed, is nevertheless, Chizkiah was matir. Now we're saying, according to Abaye, that even Rabbi Eliezer would not be matir achar achron unless you were misalik the isur. Ela hacha. So what is now the machlokas between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan? Biroim kamiflagi. Interesting how the Gemara develops its own nomenclature, its own shortened versions. Biroim, roim. Roim means to see. What does roim mean? It doesn't mean a thing.
Right.
Chizkiah leslie roim, Rabbi Yochanan isli roim. So what does the Gemara mean by roim? Roim means, do we have the ability to put aside the min b'mino, which would generate an isur because also b'mashu, freeze it, so to speak, in order to add the shelo b'mino and set up a bittul on the isur. And that's called roed. Right? So let's go back a little bit and quote the full text of the word roim. Right? Is just 1 second. Just want to get the language, sorry. Roem es haheter ki'ilu eino vashar marbin olav v'vatla. So what does that mean, roem? Roem es haheter kimisha eino. In other words, the heter of min b'mino, when the isur falls into min b'mino of heter, put the heter on the side. Because if you don't put the heter on the side, the heter becomes isur because min b'mino is also b'mashu, and then you can't be mevatel. But if you put the heter on the side, and then you marbe the mayim, the she'eno mino, then you could be mevatel. And that, in fact, is the shita of Rabbi Yochanan before the Gemara is going to slug this up, because Rabbi Yochanan Islay Roim, he accepted this mechanical principle, which is a way of being matir, this harobes, and Chizkiah did not. Frek the Gemara, me Islay the Rabbi Yochanan Roim. Does Rabbi Yochanan really commit himself to that position of Rava? Be boy Rav Asim Rabbi Yochanan. They once asked this question. They addressed it to Rabbi Yochanan. He didn't have an answer. What was the question of Roim? Shnei kosos. Right, he's got 2 cups of yayin. Echad shel chul v'echad shel truma u'mizagan. Mizagan means he diluted it with water because in those days they had concentrated wine that was undiluted. We used to have something similar here in Israel. I haven't seen it in decades. Concentrated orange juice and concentrated apple juice, and then used to add, right, 3 cups of water for every thing of orange juice or apple juice. Anyway, they used to do that with wine. And a lot of the shilas that come up today as far as Kiddush is concerned and which wine you could use revolve around this. Again, if you have dry wine, it's not diluted at all, but other wines are diluted.
Right.
And it's no gay daled kosas on Leil Pesach as well. But in any event, so what do you have here? You have 2 cups of wine that are diluted with water. One is chulin and one is truma. The irvan zebazet. And he mixed these 2 cups together. Mal. This is exactly the question of Rowan. Why? On the one hand, we could see the chulin wine, which is the heter, as if it doesn't exist. And then the wine that's being added to dilute the water, I meant to say, the water that's being added to dilute the wine is now going to be mevatel, that kos of truma. Once it's mevatel the kos of truma, then all you have is chulin. The whole tarovis is mutter. So that's called rowan. Once again, I want to say it over and over again. Rowan means that I put the kos yain of chulin on the side, because otherwise it's going to be converted to truma. And then I take the mayim, which is being used to dilute the yain, and I use it to be mevatel the yain shel truma. However, lo pashatly, Rabbi Yochanan didn't know the answer. So the Gemara answers, "Make Karlo pashatly, so pashatly." Earlier in his career, Rabbi Yochanan didn't know the answer, but later in the career, he came to a conclusion, and he committed himself to that position that we use the principle of Rowan. It's Marnami, Omer of Ami, Omer of Yochanan, V'Amri Lei, Omer of Asi, Omer of Yochanan. Shnei kosos, echad shel chula, v'echad shel truma zagon, ve'irvon zeh zeh, Rowan es haheta ki'ilu eino, v'ashar mayim marvin olav, u'mevatlin oso. Okay, now we want to get back to that last clause in the Mishnah, which always, the klal at the end is always has to be marba something. Zeh klal, min b'mina b'mashu shelo b'mashu no sein tam. Rav Shmuel, the Amri Chavayu, Rav Shmuel, Kol isur shebatorah b'mina b'mashu shelo b'mina b'nosein tam. So basically, we have a general rule for all of taroves that if it's mid b'midu, it's also b'mashu. If it's mid b'shen midu, it's b'nosein tam. So what does that Mishnah add here at the end? Zaklal, lasuye mai, what's coming to include? And the Gemara answers, lasuye kol isur shebatorah. In other words, don't think that this only applies in certain cases. Let's say, for example, in in a case of mamish min bimino, but maybe it's anyway. It applies to all isurim shebatorah, and this is coming lafuke to exclude Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The Amrit Shavai kol isurim shebatorah bein biminon bein shelo biminon b'nosein tam. And this appellant. What do you mean? Bimino b'nosein tam. Nosein tam means how much of a tam does it give off? And the answer is a ratio of 1 to 60, but it's min bimino, everything has the same tam. So you have to assume that since in min bimino, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we don't know exactly how to evaluate nosein tam. Therefore, we borrow the nosein tam from min b'sheno mino, which is 1 to 60. And all this has to do with the fact that apparently min bimino is only a chumrah d'Rabbanan. And therefore, in this Chumrah D'Rabbanu, we're going to use the same evaluations and standards that we would use for the Doraisa of Min B'Shedo Mino, and that's 1 against 60. However, Chutz Tevel V'Yayin Esek, there are 2 Isurim that are so Chomer that B'Mino B'Mashu, that even according to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, if it's Min B'Mino, like Yayin B'Yayin, or a Tevel of wheat with chulin of wheat, it's going to be oser b'mashu. Shelo b'mino v'nosein tam. Even with regard to these very strict and stringent isurim of tevel, which is a chiv misa b'dei shamayim and yayin nesech, which is an isur ano and it's avodah zara feh. Even in those cases, if it's min b'sheino mino, then let's say yayin nesech falls into mayim of heter, then we could apply the principle of nosein tam. If we didn't have the Zeh Klal at the end of the Mishnah, we would assume that the Chumrah of Mashahu would only apply to Yayin Nesach. We wouldn't know that we extended to Tevel, and the Gemara is going to have to answer the question why they extended it to Tevel. Tanya Kavose de Rav Shmuel, Tanya Kavose de Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, Tanya Kavose de Rav Shmuel. I think we have 3 more minutes. We'll try to do what we can.
Good.
So there's no exception to this rule. And that is an explicit price to support Rav and Shmuel. However, Tanya Kavasi Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish Isum Shebetorah Ben B'Mino Ben Shelo B'Minon B'Nosein Tam, that even min b'mino is only asur b'nosein tam. Chutz mitevel v'yayin nesach, that's b'mino b'mashu shelo b'mino nosein tam. Gemara says, Bishlema yayin nesach mishum chumra de avodas kol chavim. I understand why the Torah, or I should say the Rabbanan at least, would be machmir and say that yayin nesach that fell into yayin of heter should be also b'mashu, because it's avodah zara. The Torah is always machmir in avodah zara. It's cherem, it's fair, it's elatevel my taimuk. Now here the Gemara says something which is beyond my comprehension. Ke'etero kach isura, new principle. Diamar shmuel chitachas poter sakli utranami b'medvamu b'ameh omru tevel oser v'kolshu b'mino shelo b'mino b'nosein tam. The Torah has given us a halacha of mashahu with regard to tevel. How you matir tevel? You take chita achas poter sakri. All you need is to take off one chita's truma, and the entire kri, which could be gigantic, is mutter. So the Torah is already recognizing the concept of mashu. And now we're going to use the mashu in the flip side, le'isura, that a mashu of tevel that gets mixed up into 1,000 parts of heter, of chulin, is us. And that's called ketero kach isura. What's the logic behind Keteru Kach Yisuro? I honestly cannot tell you. Okay, then. So I wish you.
Okay, Shkoyach.
Hashem, we got it under the
Thank you very much.
ultimate.